Hello, welcome back. My name's Alan, and thanks for joining me again on my channel. Got another showcase for you today. This time some 28mm Mycenaean Greeks, with all the figures being provided by Wargames Foundry. What we're seeing in front of us at the moment are three solid blocks of long spear, pike-armed troops who represent the sort of lower class but still professional Greek warrior that sort of followed the heroes on their quest to Troy and around that sort of period. What we've got here are three blocks of 20. I've painted them in a triad style, basically with a black undercoat, and then predominantly using the Foundry paint scheme or system to paint a base, a mid and a highlight. As you can see, I've painted a variety of shield designs pretty much for these guys based around it looking like animal hide. So we've got mixes of browns and blacks and creams and a variety of different shield types, ranging from these round ones here to sort of figure of eight tower type shields. Really, one of the best things about the Foundry range is that we get a lot of variety and you can mix a lot of the figures in. And this is a particular favourite of mine. I painted it about 4 years ago, but let's face it, who wouldn't want an army of Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes? The heroes probably well known to a lot of you who've read the Iliad and know anything about the period. For those of you who don't, it's a really, really colourful time. It mixes history and mythology, and you're not really limited to having games of a historical basis if you don't want to. There's really loads of options for skirmishes, for raids, for actually engaging some of the, shall we say, more questionable elements like the mythology around the gods, support of the gods, and various other sort of chance happenings. Anyway, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a run through about the figures that I've painted. If we start perhaps over here on the army's left, what I've got over here on the far left is a group of lightly armed skirmishers with javelins, and behind them a really interesting unit that I liked and wanted to include it within the army. What we've got there are some Nubian mercenaries. Now, the Mycenaean Greeks got about a bit, as was their way, and New Kingdom Egypt actually recruited a number of mercenaries, and there was a bit of a general sort of exchange in terms of the combat troops of the period. So what I've modelled here are a group of Nubians who've been co-opted into joining the troops at Troy, or in that general area anyway. Not only was it just a little bit more variety for the army, but they're great troops. They're armed with missile weapons, they've got a bow, and they've got spears. So from a wargaming perspective, they're really good, useful troops to have, and I wouldn't be without them in the army. What we've got behind them, right at the very far back there, are a group of lightly armed skirmishers, again included because the sling is very useful against more heavily armoured troops. Then what about these guys in front here? Well, these guys represent the more elite elements of the army. So I've got 4 units of these, more loosely sort of formed, or have it in a looser formation compared to the sort of main blocks of spearmen. And that's because they're really sort of the link between the core infantry, who perhaps fight in a slightly more rigid format, and then the chariots that we'll see in a moment. And of course, within the Iliad, it talks a lot about heroes leading their bands of warriors. So within each one of these, I've sort of modelled a hero, and I've sort of envisaged this as their sort of personal sort of troops. Again, there's a real mix of painting in here and a real mix of figures, and that's something that I personally like, particularly in these sorts of periods where we're modelling less rigid formations, shall we say, and a more heroic style of combat, certainly in terms of the writing of the time. I've got a mixture of armour types, but this sort of banding and this edging was quite common to Mycenaean sort of art representations, so I'm quite pleased with, again, the way that they've turned out. Normal sort of basing that I use, which is a Jarvis sand and stone mix, and again really helps to sort of theme the army together. If we move back towards the centre, behind the troops that I talked about earlier are 2 solid blocks of 20 archers, not particularly well armoured. In fact, they lack shields and are generally just there to provide support. But again, that sort of missile power in terms of breaking up enemy charges, chasing off enemy skirmishers is really, really useful. And they're well screened or well protected by the heavier troops within the army. Then we come on to the army's right flank, where we've got the partnership or the other pair of warrior types. The ones in front, you'll notice, are very darkly painted. That's because they're there to simulate the troops of Achilles, or the famous Myrmidons. Now, Myrmidon in Greek derives from a word meaning ant or ant-like, and various commentators and historians have sort of theorized about what that might mean, but the most common interpretation I can find is it's to do with the fact that they're coloured and armoured in very dark styles. So in other words, a little bit like the armoured segments of an ant. So for my guys, I've painted them again with black undercoats and then used some dark greys and some slightly lighter greys to pull out that sort of theme. The actual armour on these has been washed over with a black wash as well, just to really complete the picture. And I think they work quite well as a distinct unit, and they're very different from the rest of the army. Moving to the far right here, well, our left, but the army's right, we've got 2 solid blocks of 5 chariots. Now these guys were painted well ahead of the rest of the troops. So some of them are a little bit naive in terms of the painting. I'm still pleased with them. This chap here is using the Achilles figure from the Foundry range. And again, I've mixed some sort of plain colours with some chariots that have got the sort of animal skin type effect. Most of these guys within the chariots are hero figures, but I've also mixed in plenty of the troops, the line troops, just to give a little bit of different flavour. I've actually got another, I think it's about another 10 chariots in another box that I don't tend to use in the army when I fight with it on a war games setting, and that's really because under the rules that I typically use, they're not particularly very good, but they are colourful and they do inspire the troops. My army, I decided to base on 2 main figures, Odysseus and Achilles. Those of you who know much about the Iliad will know that it's hard to get too much support for Agamemnon in some of the ways he carries on. And obviously Achilles is probably the most famous Greek there can be, but Odysseus has got that sort of element of a wily approach to warfare that I really quite liked. So this sort of army is based on the assumption that we've got excuse me, we've got some raids going on, we've got some troops being split off to carry out sort of like subordinate actions whilst the main army is perhaps still besieging Troy. And that was something that was very definitely recorded in the more historically minded sort of journals of the period. So here we're simulating Odysseus and Achilles going off on a bit of a mission, shall we say, could be a raid or some other sort of attempt perhaps to stop reinforcements getting to Troy. And you take your money and place your choice about whether you think it actually went on for about 10 years. But most commentators believe that the siege was quoted as being 10 years, simply to imply that it went on for a long time. But again, this is I think a really, really nice army to paint. Lots of different colour choices. You've got metal armour, bone armour. You've got a mixture of troops with different shields, different positions, different weapon types. And it's something that you can use in a lot of different contexts. Forget the historical stuff. If you're interested in, shall we say, fantasy games or games that are perhaps less loosely based on historical principles, then this is a great army. The Iliad's full of the support of the gods and other mythology, and that's something you can easily bring to the gaming table. As I said earlier, all painted with the Foundry sort of system, with a black undercoat, but of course you can achieve the same thing yourself using, washes or highlights as you prefer. Anyone who's got any questions about the army and how I painted it, the composition, feel free just to put a comment down below and I'll do my best to answer the question. If you've got some of your own experiences, you want to share them, again, feel free to make a few comments. And of course, as always, if you'd be kind enough to hit the subscribe button, it tells me more than anything that you enjoy the material that I'm producing, and I'll carry on showing you some other stuff. I've actually got another Greek army or two to show you. More of that a little later. What I try and do is do things a little bit differently. So take a look at the other videos that are coming up shortly, and you'll find perhaps a Greek army that you never thought you'd see. Anyway, thanks very much for your time, and thanks again for watching. My name's Alan, and I hope to join you back on the channel at some point in the near future. Thanks very much.